Do you ever find yourself drawing something and about halfway through the drawing you just go, why am I doing this? Not necessarily in the negative, but just in a I don't remember deciding to draw this thing. I don't really know how I got here. I'm just here. And maybe you're content in that moment. And maybe you're slightly bewildered, almost like you drove to school or you drove to work. And when you pull into your parking spot, you go, oh goodness, I have no memory of driving here. This used to happen to me when I was growing up. Sometimes I would drive to high school, and as I pulled into my parking spot, I would have this weird realization that I don't remember making any of the turns. I don't remember certain portions of that travel. My brain was just doing it because it had done it so many times before. And maybe that's what happens with us with drawing sometimes. We just find ourselves doing something because psychologically our brain needs it, or perhaps we have to complete something for an assignment or for a project. In fact, that's exactly what's happening in the circumstances I mentioned earlier, right? Like you have to get to school or to work, and so you do it, but your brain just kind of takes care of some of the background stuff, the habitual stuff by itself. And sometimes when you're drawing, when you're working on your artwork, the same thing happens. You just daze out for a while and you look back at what you've done and go, well, that's interesting. I didn't really plan this, but now here I am. And there's a beauty to that. There's a beauty to relegating some of your art making to this space in your brain where it's just taking care of things for you. Sometimes this happens when you're studying, though. If you're working like I am right now on some architectural stuff, you're studying something, working from reference. And in those cases, it's actually not such a good thing. If I zoned out, for example, while I was working on this gazebo or these buildings, then I lose something. I lose the potential to learn how these things are put together and how they function. But that's the strange part about art, is the fact that there are so many potential different purposes. In this case, I am drawing these little pieces of architecture to learn a little bit more about how architecture functions. In the book that I'm writing right now, I'm working on a lot of different cities. I'm in a lot of different locations, and in my brain, I kind of have ideas of what they look like. But when I sit down and try to draw them, I'm immediately reminded of how complicated architecture is, how different buildings look so extraordinarily different from one another, and I don't necessarily understand or know just from an instinctive level why that is. And so I looked up some architecture here from the Azores, a little island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that is related to Portugal. I believe it's not independently governed. I believe it is actually part of Portugal, but if you know better than me, let me know in the comments below. My wife and I visited there several years ago, and it's a really intriguing place. We have a tendency to go visit places that are a little bit off the beaten track. We went to Iceland before it was really a big deal, and we like doing that because it is less of a tourist thing and more of a we're just exploring and asking locals about things. But the architecture there was really intriguing to me. Every single town seemed to have this same church that kept popping up. It had an asymmetrical design with a bell tower on one side, and every single town we drove through seemed to have one. It was almost a little bit Twilight Zone-y, where you'd roll into the new town and be like, is this actually a different town? Or are we just somehow stuck in a time loop where we're going back on ourselves all the time? But I'm working on these architectural things because I have a fundamental lack of understanding when it comes to architecture. And from my perspective, the best way to learn how to draw a thing is to look up references for it, to work from those references, but not to do it with your mind asleep in the background, to do it actively, to try to understand what's happening, what kinds of things are occurring that make this architecture feel unique. At a base level, if you've never drawn anything architectural, you're probably going to learn how perspective functions and how all the geometric shapes interact with one another. In this case, I'm trying to understand, do all the roofs come over the top of the structure? How is water coming down? What kind of tile work? What kind of lines are being used on the tops of the structures? Those kinds of things are hopefully going to give me a better insight into the things that make the Azorian architecture look distinct. Because when we look at a picture of Tuscany or Rome, we look at a picture of London, a picture of Seoul, or a picture of Beijing, there's something about the architecture in those places that makes them recognizable. And for people who are well versed in the topics, I'm sure they could give us a very quick and succinct definition of why. But for most of us, when we look at things, we're going to have to make those distinctions ourselves. We're going to have to figure out from our perspectives what makes those things distinct. And I think the best way to start doing that is to work from reference. And then you have to follow that up with something else, right? If you're working just from reference, then you're going to get really good at drawing from reference. But if you want to get good at building things from your imagination, at building structures, for example, since this is what we're working on, you're going to have to draw a bunch of examples of it, analyze what's making them look the particular way that they look, and then you're going to have to try to execute some from memory, some from all the experience that you've garnered. And this is why you can't quite turn your mind off while you're working on the reference pieces. Because if you do, you will probably replicate them reasonably well. I'm quite good at drawing things from reference and making them look somewhat realistic. I would say photorealistic, but that's a little arrogant. But there's not a lot of purpose in that for me. When I make an oil painting, perhaps I want it to be fairly realistic, characterized by the things that the original subject matter has, but there's also some license that's taken there. But when I'm drawing most of the time, I don't really care how realistic it is. I want it to have the same qualities, the same ineffable qualities that make it feel like that thing. I think that most cartoons and abstractions of reality are often more interesting to look at and to create than the actual photorealistic representations of those things. This drawing, for example, is going to be a little bit more interesting to me than if I made a photorealistic version of it. And maybe that's just some coping because I don't want to put in the time to make it photorealistic. But I also know that if I were to spend 4 hours here studying this singular gazebo and making it as perfect as I could, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to get a whole lot out of that other than the finished result. And that's one of the strange things about working from references, is you have to figure out what your goal is. Is your goal just to have that finished result look accurate? And there's nothing wrong with it if that's your goal. For me, most of the time when I work from references, the goal is to understand the thing that I'm copying. I worked from a whole bunch of references last week on mushrooms, trying to understand the organic shapes and how they interact with one another. And the interesting thing that I found there is that there's a lot of overlap between mushrooms and other organic shapes, and that there's not a lot of overlap necessarily from one kind of mushroom to another. But you learn something about light, about form, about how shapes in our world interact by copying things that exist in our natural world. On that same token, when you copy things that are not from our natural world, things that are man-made, then you start to uncover traits that are coincident with things that are man-made. So drawing all these architectural features is probably going to make it easier if I draw other things like robots, like guitars or musical instruments, because those things are also created by humans. And there's going to be a lot of geometry and a lot of perspective and a lot of things that are just telltale signs and traits of human construction. So references give you the ability to absorb those things, but they seldom give you that ability if you only focus on copying. You have to focus on actually learning what there is to learn from those drawings. So as I make these right now, I'm paying careful attention to what shapes overlap other shapes, trying to think about the actual structure of the building. I'm fortunate enough to have had some reasonable experience building things. I've never built a house. I built the framing for a house. I built several chicken coops. But there is an understanding that comes from working with wood and metal and electricity to understand the fundamentals of how things go together. It's, again, why it's a really good thing, a really, really important thing for artists to do things other than art, because everything you engage in can show up in your artwork later. But all that aside, when you're working on references like this, the more that you do and the more that you try to understand the actual physical structure of what's happening and why, the better that will influence your drawings in the future. So the more that I look at how things are laid out here, not necessarily how the shadows are cast or anything, though that's really important, I'm thinking about how the building is actually constructed. For me, the problem often comes to the roof. I've drawn a lot of perspective drawings over the years, and I'm pretty good with the shapes by themselves. But I have a tendency to just put triangles on top of boxes. And that's not really how we build things. So that's part of what I'm paying attention to here. I'm paying attention to the subtleties of what overlaps what. And when you draw something, it's easy, if you understand that, to decide which shape goes down first. That's often the mistake I make. I often put the roof on after I've gotten the structure for the bottom portion of the building put together, and then it's hard to put it on as an overlapping shape on the top, especially when I work with pens so frequently. If I worked in digital media or in pencil more frequently, it probably wouldn't be quite as big a problem. But it is an issue because of the way that I work. So if you find yourself working from references and you find that you are not improving, you're not metabolizing that information nearly as well as you'd like to, I would encourage you to think about what you're thinking about when you work from the references. If you're watching TV shows, if you are watching YouTube videos that borrow or steal your concentration, be careful. There are certain things that I can do that for, but I find that I listen to lore from video games when I'm doing a lot of my drawing, and I kind of don't pay particularly good attention to it. I am mostly using it as background noise, like a fan when I go to sleep at night, to distract me just a little bit so that I can actually focus on the drawing at hand. But if you find that you are listening to music and it is distracting you, you're singing along with it, and when you get to the end of a referential drawing session and you don't really feel like you absorb much, I would encourage you to cut out some of the distractions. If you're listening to this video right now while you're doing that and it is distracting you, turn it off and focus on what you're drawing. Try to see what you can absorb when you give it more of your attention. I tend to listen to things while I'm drawing, and it's mostly just to occupy the background of my brain so that it's easier for me to concentrate on what I'm working on. But there have been times recently where I have decided to listen to nothing, just to draw in absolute silence, and it is rewarding. My brain seems to function much better. It understands that, oh, we're working right now. We have things to absorb. We have things to learn. And my brain seems to allocate those things faster. It seems to understand them and metabolize them faster. So I would encourage you to try something similar. But drawing from reference is important. We learn a lot through the process. Some people don't draw from reference very much. They tend to just look at the things that they want to work from and study them by examining them, by really just absorbing that visual data. And that's fine too. I struggle with that. My memory seems to lose those pieces pretty quickly afterwards. But references are important. They teach us a lot. Teach us a lot about the world around us, about how light and form function. And if you concentrate and you allow yourself to really absorb those things, you will grow, and you will grow faster than you would otherwise. Well, as always, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Let me know what you've been working on from reference recently in the comments below. I'd love to hear. Thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When for your support. If you would like to support the channel, check out our Patreon in the link below. And if you are looking for some artistic community, check out the Discord. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.